and welcome back to LendAPI Academy. My name is Kay, and this is episode 3 in our Rules and Decision series. In this series, we're going to be diving deep into the rules engine as well as the pricing engine within the LendAPI platform and teaching you how to build your very own product. We're going to be building one of the most complex decisioning products in the financial sector, aka the mortgage loan. We left off the last episode building the first branch of the actual decisioning tree for the mortgage loan. To jog your memory a little bit, the first branch is really what I would call the baseline checks for the loan. We're going to be checking for employment types, FICO scores, and of course debt to income ratio, making sure that at the very least, financially, an applicant is solvent to move forward. And of course, if you are not, we do have these decline settings set in place. As you can imagine, if you are declined, you are set with a decline outcome. You will notice we did not publish this rule, and the reason for that is because we have yet to set an approved outcome as part of this particular first branch. And to do that, it's because we need to build out the next set of branches within this tree. And this node is where we connect the next branch of this tree. So let's go ahead and build the next branch within our mortgage loan. So we're going to go ahead and add another decision tree. And this will be step 2 in our PL mortgage. And this will be the second step. Branch of mortgage. So in this branch, we're really going to be focused more on some of the smaller details, specifically the property details for which you are applying for this loan. So one of the common pieces that we need to check are occupancy types. So if you remember, or if you've ever applied for a mortgage loan, one of the questions that you ask on an application is, what are you going to be utilizing this property for? Is it going to be for a primary residence or secondary residence? We have created this occupancy type variable in our variable studio for users to select either a primary residence or a secondary residence during the application. So now we're going to set actual parameters around it. If you are a primary residence, or if the user selects primary residence, there will of course be lower risk, and the user will be able to have obviously a larger loan amount or versus their value, aka their LTV. So now that we've set the first node with the rule, let's set some child branches. So if you are a primary residence, the next thing we will need to check is your LTV, or your loan to value ratio. And we're going to be checking this utilizing our calculated LTV, which we've created as a derived variable. And the way we're calculating LTV for this particular loan is, of course, subtracting the value of the loan from the down payment and dividing it all by the property value or the purchase price. And with that, we're going to set some standards. So for this LTV, we don't want to have too high of an LTV, but it is a primary residence, so we can set it a lot higher than you would a secondary residence. So for this, let's set the LTV to be less than or equal to 90. And this just means that you need to put out, all you need to do is put down a down payment of 10% of the value of your house. So as long as you have that, I think for us, the next step is to actually approve you to qualify for a rating or a rate and term sheet to be presented. So let's go ahead and create a child note for this LTV. So we'll do approval, approved for this loan, and this will actually be an action. And this will be set as a action for the LTV itself. We approve, and then we will set this action based on the outcomes we've already set in the decision outcomes. So now we can save this action. And let's go back and let's start to build out some more pieces of this particular branch. So what if you don't have a LTV, or you don't have more than 10% or to put down for your house? Well, unfortunately, that cannot move forward, so we are going to do a decline action for this particular tree. So we are going to actually decline this outcome and set it as declined and save this outcome. And now we have both outcomes set for what our primary residence will be able to qualify for. So if you are not a primary resident, then you will most likely be a secondary resident, because this is, of course, a required field and we only have a two selector dropdown for this particular variable. So let's set a rule for a secondary resident. So what we can do here, we can put in another check, another occupancy recheck. And let's create a rule around it. And we'll set this to be a node for if you are not, in fact, a primary resident. And here's what we'll do, and we'll make sure to see if the user has selected secondary residence. And let's save this rule. Now, of course, if you are not a primary resident or a secondary resident, you most likely did not fill out this particular field, which means that you do not qualify. So if they fail both primary resident and their subsequent secondary resident, then the no node for this will be a decline. And of course, we don't necessarily need to have this particular recheck, but it's always good to have certain pieces within your tree. And then, of course, if you are a secondary residence and you want to proceed forward, actually need to set another action for this. So what we want to do is we can continue with this particular branch, but I think it's actually prudent for us to create another branch within this tree to just check for secondary residence. So in this, I'm going to name this node for secondary residence check. And this, of course, will be an action for now. And we will choose the approved action, but no outcome because we're going to select another child tree for this. So again, if you remember from the last video, the approved action is the best way to proceed with more branches in the tree because all it does is it will filter between either an outcome or a decision tree. It doesn't stop the decision engine in its tracks like it would otherwise a decline. A decline will automatically stop the rule from proceeding, but if you set this as an approved action, you can actually move forward. So we're going to do that. And now let's go back and create our final and third tree. So this will be step 3 in our BL mortgage. And this will be our third branch for secondary checks, secondary residence checks. So moving backwards, we've created our final branch of our decision tree. So in order to come here, you have, if you remember, you have to be a secondary resident. So we did a recheck. You have to have selected secondary residence. And we're going to do another FICO score check. So like I've mentioned earlier, if you are not utilizing this loan for a primary residence, the financials for applying for this loan is going to be a lot more strict. So in this case, we're going to need to do a FICO recheck. So we're going to be leveraging, of course, the FICO score of the primary borrower. And we're going to check in our base tree, we had a base FICO score of 550 in order to pass. I think that is more so in line for a primary resident. Of course, if you are buying a second home or a rental property, you're going to need a much higher FICO score. So I think we're going to set this particular FICO score to be closer to the 700 range. I think we'll set it as 690. So your FICO score has to be greater than or equal to 690 in order to proceed. In this, we're also going to do a recheck of our debt to income ratio. So if you are, of course, greater than 690, then we're going to need to recheck your DTI. And we're going to set this as our child node after FICO score. So the DTI that we set for our primary tree was rather high. I believe it was around the 80 mark. So for this one, I think we're going to set our DTI much lower because, of course, in order to qualify for a secondary home or secondary residence, we probably want you to have more money in the bank. So let's set this DTI closer to the 50 mark. So of course, if you are not within this particular range, you do not qualify for a secondary home loan. So our final check is going to, for this particular loan, is going to be our LTV. So if you qualify for both FICO and DTI, we're going to need to do an LTV recheck. And the LTV that we did for our primary residence was rather high. It was 90% or 90, which means that all you need to do is put down a 10%, which meant that all you need to do is put down a 10% down payment. Well, for a secondary residence, I think we need to have a LTV of a much lower percentage. So that means that you're going to need to put more down. So let's set this one to be less than or equal to 60. So in order to qualify for a second residence or secondary home, you're going to need to put down at least 40%. So with that, we're going to set these rules. And now let's engineer back. So if you do qualify for all of these filters and base qualifications for a secondary home, then you are approved. And this will be our final node within our third branch. And this we can actually set with an outcome of approved. And you'll see we've already set our approved outcome here in our decision outcomes. So let's go ahead and save this particular node. And of course, now we have to set some decline branches or nodes in place. So we're going to set our first decline for our LTV check. Of course, if you don't pass, you will be declined to move forward. And then the second decline will be for our debt to income ratio. Of course, if you do not have the proper debt to income ratio, you will also be declined. And then our final decline will be for FICO score. So if you do not pass this base FICO score for a secondary residence, you will be declined, unfortunately. So with that, it looks like we've set all of the... So now that we've closed the loop in our third branch, let's test the tree and publish it. So I'm going to do something safe and test at a very high FICO score of 760 with a, let's say, $50,000 gross debt with, let's say, $100,000 of annual income, and of course $100,000 annual income for my co-borrower. And the property price, let's set as $500,000. And our down payment as $250,000. This should get us to an approved, and it does. Okay, let's change one of the variables and set our FICO score to be 600. And it's a decline. This is working. Let's set our FICO score back to 700. And let's set the property price, or let's set the down payment now to closer to be 50,000. And again, we are declined. Let's set the down payment back to be 200,000. And now we're approved. Everything looks to be good. So let's go ahead and publish this decision tree and let's connect it back to our decision engine. So we're going to go to view our versions, and since we've already tested, and ready to publish. Of course, as always, remember that in order to publish any decision tree, there is an added step of governance for a secondary user to come in and review and make sure the decision tree is ready to go and tested before utilizing. So our third branch is ready to go. Now let's connect it back to our second branch. So you will see within our second branch we have everything connected, and ready to go. The only thing that's left is the approved action for a secondary residence check. So we are going to actually set this to be step 3 in our mortgage. So this is going to, so once the decision filter hits this particular node, it's actually going to go into this third branch of the decision tree versus an outcome. And this is exactly how a child tree works within the LendAPI platform. So let's do a recheck of everything and let's test this tree out and see what we get. So with that, let's do a primary residence. And let's do the property price at $500,000. Let's set a lower standard. Let's do $150,000 for our down payment, and we should get it approved, correct? Now let's do a little bit lower. Let's set $90,000. This does fall, let's do maybe even lower than that. Let's do $40,000. Now I think this falls below our 10% threshold, which does produce a decline. Now, going back to that, let's set this back to $200,000. This should definitely get us approved. And now instead, let's do this as a secondary residence. And we're going to set this, and it is approved. Looks like this tree is working correctly. So we are ready to submit to approve our second decision tree. So we're going to submit this. And of course, with the added governance, there's always an approval process. We go into versions to approve. And let's publish our second branch. So now that we've published our second branch, the last branch we have to do is our main branch, our starting point of our decision tree. Just double checking. Oh, our FICO score needs a little bit of an adjustment. We're setting this as 550, and of course it's going to be greater than or equal to 550. And checking our debt to income ratio, less than 60. Everything here looks good. So let's test this last rule. Oh, 1 second, almost forgot. Now, we're going to change this node from approved to, say, our occupancy check. So the reason for that is we are actually not going to be leveraging full approval just based on one branch. This action is going to go into our step 2 of our mortgage loan, and we're going to save this particular node and doing one last check of everything, making sure all these nodes are correct. Looks like we're ready to test. So we are going to test our FICO score of 700. We know that's going to pass. Let's do our gross debt as 1,000, and then 100,000 for our annual income, and of course 100,000 for a co-borrower. And then employment type, we will say employed. And this does give us a full approved action. Now let's lower our threshold a little bit, and let's do 500 for a FICO score. This does give us a decline. Let's now push it back to 750, but here we're going to do unemployed. and decline. Now let's do full time, and we're back to approved. Looks like this tree is working. So, as always, let's submit this for approval. And as always, our last tree, we need to just make sure it's buttoned up and tested. And we're ready to go. All right, looks like all of our trees are connected. So we're now ready to connect it back to our product studio. We're going to drop off here and come back next time as we finalize our decision tree and then connect it back to our products within Product Studio. And as always, thank you. And please remember to subscribe and follow us for more content.